Thomas had always dreamed of making a discovery that would etch his name into history. As an amateur scientist and treasure hunter, he spent years chasing myths, hoping to prove that legends were often rooted in truth. When he first stumbled upon the wreckage beneath the waves, his heart pounded with excitement. The stories had always seemed far-fetched: a missing airplane, a lost archaeologist, a cursed treasure. But now, the evidence lay before him. His fingers trembled as he reached out, brushing away the layers of seaweed and silt that covered the aircraft's exterior. The fuselage was eerily intact, a ghostly remnant of an age-old disappearance. If this was what he thought it was, it would be the greatest find of his life. It would make him the renowned scientist he had always wanted to be. His colleagues had warned him. They told him that some things were better left undisturbed. But Thomas wasn't one to heed warnings. He had worked too hard to back out now. As he swam around the wreckage, searching for a way inside, his oxygen supply began to dwindle. He had to surface before he could make another attempt. Just as he turned to leave, a sharp sound echoed through the water. A knock. Thomas froze. His mind scrambled for a logical explanation. It must have been a trick of the current, a shifting piece of metal. But then it came again. Louder this time. The rhythmic tapping against the airplane's thick windows sent a chill through his body. Could someone still be inside? Panic surged through him. He kicked off the sea floor, rising toward the surface as fast as he could. If there was even the slightest chance that someone was alive, he needed to act fast. Back on his boat, he gasped for air, trying to steady his nerves. He had no spare oxygen tanks with him. He would have to return to the mainland to get more supplies before making another dive. But time was slipping away, and the weather was turning against him. Dark clouds rolled in over the horizon. The wind howled through the sails, and waves began to toss his boat like a mere toy in the vast ocean. Thomas gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel as the first drops of rain stung his skin. He had sailed through storms before, but this one was different. This one felt alive. A monstrous wave rose before him, towering like a beast ready to swallow him whole. He barely had time to brace himself before it crashed down, flipping his boat in an instant. Water filled his lungs as he was dragged down into the abyss. He struggled against the current, kicking desperately toward the surface. When he finally broke through, he gasped, his vision blurring from exhaustion. His boat was gone, reduced to nothing but splintered wood, floating aimlessly. With no other choice, he clung to a broken plank, his body trembling with cold and fatigue. Hours passed. The storm subsided, but Thomas was barely conscious. His limbs ached. His mind drifted between wakefulness and darkness. Just as he was about to give up, he heard voices. "Hey, over here!" Strong hands pulled him from the water. The warmth of a blanket wrapped around him, and the scent of salt and fish filled his nostrils. He blinked, barely registering the two fishermen who had saved him. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging wary glances. "Where did you come from?" one of them asked. Thomas tried to answer, but his throat was too dry. He coughed and forced himself to sit up. The village they brought him to was unfamiliar. It wasn't anywhere near where he had been before. He had no idea how he had drifted so far off course. As he staggered through the village, he quickly realized something was off. The people eyed him with suspicion. Some whispered as he passed. Others shut their doors when they saw him coming. He had hoped to find help, supplies, a way back to the wreckage, but instead he was met with cold stares and silence. After wandering for what felt like an eternity, he finally stumbled upon a small tavern. The owner took pity on him, offering him food and a place to sleep. But the moment Thomas mentioned the sunken airplane, the mood in the room changed. The villagers believed in the legend. They had heard stories of the cursed treasure buried beneath the waves, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Most of them left, shaking their heads, muttering about fools who played with fate. all except one man. From the darkest corner of the room a figure stirred. A man with sunken eyes and a jittery demeanor stepped forward. He spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I believe you," he said. Thomas frowned. "Who are you?" "Andy," the man replied, a strange smile curling his lips. "The town freak." Thomas narrowed his eyes. There was something unsettling about Andy, but he needed an ally. Someone who knew the area, someone who could help him get back. Andy leaned in, his voice trembling with excitement. "I know about the airplane, about the treasure. People say it's cursed, but I don't believe that. I think it's been waiting for the right person to find it." Thomas hesitated. He didn't believe in curses, but he couldn't deny that something strange was happening. The knocking, the storm, the way the villagers reacted. But he had to go back. Aim said, "If you help me," Thomas said, "I'll share the discovery with you." Andy's grin widened. "Then let's find out if the legend is true." That night Thomas couldn't sleep. The images of the wreckage haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cracked windows, heard the tapping sound. He had to know what was inside. Unable to shake the unease, he slipped out of his room and wandered into the night. The village library stood in the distance, its doors slightly ajar. He pushed them open and stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old books and dust. He searched for hours, flipping through pages, piecing together fragments of history, and then he found it. A faded photograph, an old newspaper article. His heart nearly stopped. The image confirmed everything Andy had said. The plane, the archaeologist, the treasure. It was all real. But just as he was about to tear out the pages for evidence, he heard footsteps. He wasn't alone. Thomas stiffened, his fingers frozen on the brittle pages of the book. The footsteps echoed through the dimly lit library, slow and deliberate. He wasn't just imagining things. Someone was there. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a shadow moving between the towering bookshelves. His pulse quickened. He could still hear the faint shuffle of feet, drawing closer with every second. Carefully he closed the book and slid it back onto the shelf, trying to act as though he had never touched it. Then, without making a sound, he stepped backward, inching toward the nearest exit. A creaking floorboard betrayed him. The shadow shifted, moving directly into his path. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "Leaving so soon?" A deep, gravelly voice cut through the silence. Thomas spun around and found himself face to face with a tall, gaunt man dressed in dark clothing. His piercing eyes glowed faintly under the dim candlelight of the library. Thomas swallowed hard. I was just looking for information." The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "And did you find what you were looking for?" Thomas hesitated. He didn't want to reveal too much, but something about this man told him that lying would be a mistake. "Maybe," Thomas said cautiously. "Who are you?" The man took a step forward, his boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. "Someone who has been watching you, Thomas." Thomas's stomach turned. How did this man know his name? "You shouldn't have come here," the man continued. "You shouldn't have found that plane." Thomas's mind raced. Who was this man? Was he connected to the archaeologist? The treasure? Before Thomas could respond, the stranger reached into his coat. Thomas tensed, expecting a weapon, but instead the man pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He held it out. "Take it." Thomas hesitated before cautiously accepting the paper. As he unfolded it, his eyes widened. It was a hand-drawn map, marked with coordinates. "The plane is only part of the story," the man said. "If you really want to know the truth, follow this." Thomas looked up, but before he could ask another question, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, Thomas just stood there, gripping the map. His heart pounded. This was getting bigger than he ever imagined. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the library, followed by a crash. Thomas jumped, his body tense. When he turned toward the source of the noise, he saw nothing but a toppled bookshelf. He wasn't alone in here. Without another thought, Thomas sprinted out of the library, clutching the map tightly in his hands. He ran through the empty village streets, the cold night air burning his lungs. He needed to get back to the hotel, to Andy. When he burst into his room, he nearly jumped out of his skin. Andy was sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for him. "What the hell are you doing here?" Thomas demanded, still catching his breath. Andy shrugged. "I could ask you the same thing." Thomas hesitated. Should he tell Andy about the man? About the map? Andy tilted his head. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas took a deep breath and handed him the map. Andy unfolded it, his eyes scanning the markings. His expression shifted from curiosity to pure excitement. "You know what this is?" Andy whispered. Thomas shook his head. "All I know is that it's connected to the plane." Andy grinned. "Then what are we waiting for?" The next morning, they set out. With what little money they had left, they rented an old fishing boat from a reluctant villager. As they sailed out toward the coordinates, the ocean stretched endlessly before them. Thomas kept a close eye on Andy, still unsure if he could fully trust him. Hours passed before they reached their destination. The water beneath them was eerily calm, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Thomas adjusted his diving gear. "Ready?" Andy nodded. "Let's find out what's down there." They plunged into the depths, the cold water surrounding them. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The sunlight barely reached this far, and Thomas could only make out the ghostly outline of something massive beneath them. And then they saw it. A second wreckage. This one wasn't an airplane. It was a ship. A massive, ancient shipwreck, covered in coral and marine life. Thomas's mind reeled. This wasn't just about a missing archaeologist. This was about something much, much older. Andy signaled to him, pointing toward an opening in the hull. Without hesitation, they swam inside. The interior was eerie, the wooden beams creaking under the pressure of the water. As they moved through the wreckage, Thomas spotted something glinting in the dim light. A chest. Heart-pounding, he and Andy pried it open. Inside, wrapped in decayed fabric, was a magnificent diamond the size of a man's fist. Its surface shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Andy's hands trembled. "We just became rich, my friend." But Thomas wasn't so sure. As they turned to leave, something shifted in the shadows behind them. A presence, a shape. The water around them grew colder, and a deep resonant sound echoed through the wreckage. Then, the knocking began again. They weren't alone. The end.